today we're doing the hardcore panel as a part of a mini conference. The other panel will be in a few hours, and that is for the hip hop panel. But basically how it's going to work is there's going to be a handful of presenters, and then they will open, the floor will be opened to a Q&A and sort of a conversation between the panel, between the presenters. That's the sort of panel aspect to all of this. And so I want to take a moment here to let everybody introduce themselves. And so we'll just go in order of the presentations. I'm David McKerracher, already said that. And I'll be talking about inherent transgression as opposed to actual rebellion. Right. And the title of my talk will be Unruly in the Pit, because conflicting notions of what constitutes actual acts of rebellion kind of is one of the things that's underlying a lot of confusion that goes down in mosh pits, hardcore pits, slam dance pits, whatever you might understand them as. And they're all kind of different, but related. And so that's what I'll be talking about. And I started Theory Underground, and that's my main media project. And everybody else, I think the order of this is, hold on, let me pull it up really quick, put it on the screen here so you can all see it. So it's me, then Elton, George, Bryce, Nance, and Jason Myles. So let's start with Elton. We'll go through that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Elton L.K. So I do podcasts for Democratic Socialists of America called Class. Also have my own podcast that's been on the hold for a little while, but it's on Gramsci, called The Working Class Intelligentsia. And my background is some punk and hardcore, then that kind of evolved into emo and hardcore, and then indie rock. But I'll talk about that in more detail in a bit, as well as my talk is mostly just, kind of some thoughts and insights that I have about, like, the scene and selling out and the avant-garde, and tying in with like Gramsci, we've got culture and what the effects are on culture and how that relates to politics.
Thank you. George?
Yeah, right on. I'm George Dick, and I've taken courses with both Philosophy Portal and Theory Underground in the past, and I'm based out of Winnipeg right now, which in the 80s had a really vibrant like punk scene that, you get Propaganda and Comeback Kid out of. But I mostly listen to metal, so like black metal, death metal. This is kind of what turns my crank. And I'm going to talk about what metal is, like specifically that metal doesn't really define itself, but defines it by what it's not, and how the poser is like a key role in quilting, like a quilting point for this idea. And then I'll connect this to Lacan's idea of jouissance and seeing it as like an important force that unites the kind of membership of being in the metal community.
Thank you. Nance?
I am Nance, and I am just an enjoyer. I don't produce media or content. I'm a consumer. And I grew up a punk rock kid. I was homeless at 14, and did the thing for a while, and played in a couple bands, but never more than like house parties. And then I grew up and kind of set all that aside to like work and pay bills and shit. But like the idea of punk rock and hardcore and the ideals Yeah, like they're still important to me. They still matter to me, but also I kind of don't have any idea what they are. And I kind of just want to explore that, like the fact that we posit this thing, but we never articulate it. Like we never actually define what we're aspiring to or judging others against. Yeah.
Thank you. And then Jason.
My name is Jason Myles. I am, like Nance said, a fan and consumer of this genre of music. I got to make heavy music. I don't know what you call it, what genre specific box it sits in, for several years. I don't have the wall of books behind me like many of my contemporaries in the podcast world. I actually have a wall of posters of venues that I played over the years in various parts of the planet. And I'm going to talk about the cultures of authenticity and the cultures of deconstruction that kind of exist in this musical milieu that work to negate any sort of real movement outside of the true fans of the genre.
Thank you, everybody. So I spent a lot of time before we started recording today kind of talking about stuff that came up, because what we're doing right now is being dragged on Twitter. And of course, we're not supposed to take Twitter seriously, but of course, once you see some things, the little worms get inside your brain and you can't stop thinking about it. And so we actually, talked it through. This is the thumbnail for what's going to go up. As you can see, it's Twitter people upset that our little baby, Underground Theory, a volume with 31 contributors, is about to be released. Some of those people are upset with some of the people's expressed opinions or political positions. Other people are upset that, oh, that person with that big name, that person's popular, and you can't do stuff with popular people and keep it underground. So much for the underground. And of course, it couldn't have happened on a better day, because today is the day of this conference, which is so that we can talk about Underground Theory. What is this term underground in relation to theory? And one person in particular had retweeted it and said they never thought they'd live to see the day of low theory, but here we are. And I just wanted to say that's honestly one of the most revealing things I've ever heard or seen. The idea that the underground is supposed to mean that we keep it low, that we keep it, what are you talking about? You're not supposed to do a good job. You're not supposed to associate with other people who are experts in fields or have any sort of, lifelong experience in a field. You're just supposed to jot theory poetry on your own without reading great thinkers. You're not supposed to be situated in a milieu of great thinkers throughout history and actually in dialogue with them. No, workers, first of all, you should get back to work. You shouldn't be thinking for yourselves. But if you're going to be thinking for yourselves, well, then you have to think for yourself. No thinking with great thinkers. No using concepts developed by great thinkers, right? And definitely no intervening in these fields. And of course, some people would say, well, of course you should intervene in these fields, but you should only do so critically. And that's why, of course, I at least would respond that before you critique, you actually have to get to know the field. You got to kind of understand what you're in before you start shooting off from the hip. But, this is the internet, and people do what people do on the internet, which is just fire off from the hip whatever comes to mind. And so really we can't take it too seriously, but that's kind of what we do here, is we take everything seriously, too seriously perhaps, but we also like to have fun while we're doing it. And so what I wanted to do today is kind of just a quick sort of sketch of a piece that I'm kind of thinking through. I haven't written it yet, but it was inspired by a concert that I went to in Roseville, California, a month and a half ago, probably like a month ago. And so I don't know if anybody remembers My Children, My Bride, MySpace days. heavy. They had that famous song Headshot where they yell headshot a lot, and it's like, I don't know, a Halo song or something like that. But Matthew, the frontman, was kind of iconic back then because he had giant plugs before anybody else had giant plugs. Like his were like 2.5 or 3 inch plugs, and everyone was like, wow, that's so cool. But I didn't go for My Children, My Bride. Of course, I mean, it's cool for nostalgic purposes to see something like that. I went to see a friend's band, and then the friend's band wasn't actually there because they were going to be a part of the tour, and then they dropped last second. But I met a new friend while I was there, and he's the front man in a band called The Dispersers, and his name is Murphy. Apparently he's well known on TikTok. I don't really know, but Dispersers was the opening act. And, you know, raise of hands, like how many people are familiar with like pit, like hardcore pits? Like how you guys get what goes down in a hardcore pit? Like, yeah. Okay. So not everybody is. And the people who are presenting here probably do. But we'll take hands later, by the way. Right now it would mess up the OBS screen if I have that enabled. But so the pit, it's something that comes out of hardcore and metal. Both metal and hardcore have the pit. Usually in the mosh scene, in the metal scene, the pit is moshing, and in the hardcore scene, people they might two-step, or they might like throw their arms. And I'll just go ahead and just show it for people who don't know. It's like they'll just like throw their arms like this and like that, you know. And like basically you don't want to get close to somebody who's doing this because you'll get your teeth knocked out. And so moshing and dancing do not go together. Not very well anyways. There's obviously bands where this is kind of the thing, is that clash of these two kinds of pit. And if you've ever been at a show where people are trying to do that kind of thing in the same spot, it's a disaster. And so, you know, I was a big time mosher before I got into the dancing stuff. The dancing stuff took a lot more skill, so I didn't really want to do it. And then eventually I felt like I really could do that. That looks like a lot of fun. I want to do that. And so I got involved with it, and it is a great way to be a participant in the moment that is kind of being created by the band. As long as the band is there for it and that's what they actually appreciate and that's what they want from participants, then it's awesome. And I'm all about it. But then people who don't really understand pit etiquette will try to take that style of throwing down into a metal pit at some show where that's not even what the band members are trying to get from the audience. And then it's just really stupid. It's cringy. And I don't know why I have this up on the screen. I'm going to pause what I'm saying just for a second here and change how we're doing this. I'm going to make it so I was going to sit here and type things out as I talked, but I decided I'm not going to do that. So let me just do this. It's just us. We'll be the ones up here. There we go. Okay. So that's the what I would say is like the sort of rough sort of sketch of the pit. You don't really need to know a whole lot more to understand what's going on in my talk, but just know that I come from that kind of a thing, and so I've been in a lot of fights with people who were trying to do the wrong thing in a pit. And I was never the person who was some asshole. I was always just like, oh no, we do that over there. This is for this. And then people get all like upset because you're telling them what to do. People don't think that they should have to listen to you tell them what to do, because especially for people trying to mosh at a hardcore show, they're just there to push. They just want to push. And it's like, yeah, but now you're getting upset because you're getting, you know, people's fists hitting your face. It's not personal, dude. You're just doing the wrong thing in the wrong space. And this is kind of going to become very important as an analogy for making this connection between underground music and underground theory, is the understanding that different spaces are made for different things, and that different people have different purposes for why they get involved in making certain spaces. Or if we want to use this idea of space being like this sort of infinite thing. There's just space everywhere. What humans do is they get together and they turn arbitrary space into a purposeful place. This is now for this. That is why we're here, is to do this thing, right? So that's how I think about it. And so I go to Roseville, and I threw down just to kind of like, support dispersers, and then I met Murphy, the front man, afterwards, and we were talking and having a good time. But a bunch of his friends, his new friends from Reno, were there, and I didn't know that they were from Reno just yet. But they were like wearing masks and kind of being douchebags in the pit, and I was kind of confused about what was going on. Because I didn't know they were from Reno, I just assumed, well, this is just some California shit. They look like Hollywood Undead or whatever. Okay, I mean that's a thing, I guess, still. And so, but I'm trying to reserve judgment because I don't really understand how things work in the scene, because it's a different scene, and you're supposed to kind of observe and kind of get to know the norms of the scene before forming judgments or thinking how it should go down. Of course, I think that everything should be the way it is in Spokane, Washington, but no, different people do things different ways, and so I'm trying to be more of an anthropologist in this situation and just observe or participate to the best of my ability. But then these guys started trying to fight with people who obviously were locals, obviously are good friends of kind of everyone there, very supportive of everybody there. These are the kinds of people who, when you fall down, they jump to pick you up and slap you on the back. And they're like, everyone's getting their aggravation and anxiety and stresses of daily life, like cathartically released there in the pit. But there's a sense of brotherhood. There always is in a pit. And so, or at least they're supposed to be, right? But then these guys, no sense of brotherhood. It's like these 5 guys versus the world. And they're trying to start fights with all these people. And I'm like, oh, and they're from out of town. So once I found out they're from out of town, I was like, oh, what the fuck is going on here? It's a phenomenon that I'd seen plenty of times up in Spokane as well, where people, they go on some kind of a road trip to go into somebody else's scene and then start shit. It's like this whole thing. And they ended up getting thrown out. I was almost a part of some fight because this guy was starting shit again, but the security intervened, threw the guys out, told them, get the fuck out of here. And it was like, okay, well, good, because they were just here to fuck shit up. They weren't really here for the music. They weren't really here for the scene. They had no respect for the venue. They didn't have respect for anyone else who was going there, right? And so I walked up to Murphy and I said, are those people your friends? And he said, yeah. And I said, Murphy, you need to teach your friends some pit etiquette. Because I know that he knows pit etiquette, because he was throwing down, for the other bands as well. Usually a front man doesn't come into the pit and really support the bands that come after, them as an opening act. And so I was already kind of impressed that he was being so supportive of all these other bands. And I was just like, you need to teach them some pit etiquette. And he goes, what can I say? They're unruly. And so Murphy, I dedicate this presentation to you, because you've had me thinking a lot about what it really means to be unruly, right? What is rebellion? What is resistance? What is revolution? All of these things are different. None of them are even synonyms for one another, right? You can be resisting, and that's not revolutionary, right? And you can be rebelling without resisting, or can you? These are technically philosophical questions. There's something for us to start thinking through. I'm more interested in advancing the questions than I am in positing some kind of a take, right? I'm not here to say, well, this is my take and this is the way that it is. So much as to say, I think these things are a little bit more complicated. But as far as I can understand, or how I'm thinking about it right now, is that this kind of unruliness, where you go into somebody's scene and you just go there to fuck shit up, isn't really resistance. It's not really rebellion, unless the only thing you're interested in rebelling against is like a local underground scene. In which case, what? You gonna go listen to Katy Perry afterwards? Like you're just a representative of the mainstream here to fuck shit up for everybody in the underground? Is that what's going on? Of course, I don't think that they've really thought through things. I just want them to begin to think through things. And so I wanted to lay out a couple of distinctions. First of all, I have to set up a theoretical concept that comes from the work of Slavoj Žižek. It's inherent transgression. This is the kind of transgression inherent to the system or the status quo as it currently exists already. So in the act of resisting, you think you're doing a rebellion, but in reality, it's a form of transgression inherent to the system already, right? Every time some DIY underground shit really finds something new and gets excited about it, it gets kind of appropriated by the mainstream, by a bunch of people who just want to rip off the sound, people who don't really have any respect for the roots of where this is coming from, much less like its roots in ideas, its ethos, right? And inherent transgression, I think, goes along with the idea of things being appropriated into the status quo. It goes along with the idea of things being co-opted. And I think a lot of resistance and rebellion are, with quotes around it, I think that those are often forms of inherent transgression. And yeah, like I said, I'm mostly just interested in kind of like putting that forward as something we really need to think through. Is all underground music just a form of inherent transgression? Is it really just an opportunity for individuals to get together in niche consumer demographics to vent their emotions in a cathartic yet nonetheless harmless way? Like the worst thing that you're going to do is knock out the tooth of one of your friends. Right? You're not going to hurt the system. I mean, really, the system benefits all around, doesn't it? It's not like you've taken some essential energy away from the beast and now you have it over here in your little niche scene. The thing keeps chugging along just fine. You're going to go back to work tomorrow, right? Going back to work. I mean, that's really the system as we know it. That's the relations of productions that makes the system what it is. And you're still going to go back to work, but because you went and you vented it all out in the pit, now going back to work, okay, I can deal with work for one more week, right? And so you have to go back to work, but it's okay. No matter how frustrating your boss is, you'll be able to vent that aggression in the pit, right? Well, that doesn't help you build camaraderie with your coworkers, right? Your coworkers who you probably hate because they listen to stupid butt rock bands or whatever, right? This drawing away the energy that feels the need to resist and then releasing it in the pit, how does this actually help us do anything to build a working class movement? Arguably it could, but we've had a lot of time since the 70s, and I don't know really what's come of it besides personal liberation. Because for me, it has been personally liberating, and I don't want to say that personal liberation is somehow not important. Neither do I want to say that small communities of people finding a way to cope in society is not a meaningful form of resistance, but it's still caught up in inherent transgression. And so these are the kinds of questions that I think about, the kinds of things that I'm hystericizing myself about. But I think for closing this talk out, what I want to say is that there are norms, rules, and the law. The law is on the side of the big other. The rules, more or less, are part of the big other. The norms of society at large, though, as well as the rules and laws of society at large, are not the same thing as the rules, norms, and law of the scene, of the venue, of the labels, the production companies, the organizers. That between all of those entities, there are different competing ideas about like what the norms should be. And then there are certain rules that they have to operate under, because ultimately there's also law outside of them. So the venue, for instance, has to check IDs at the door. Oh, that's not very punk to do. You shouldn't do that. Well, this rule is based in the fact that that venue has to exist in a society, and that society has law. Now, if you want to resist the law, you don't take it out on the venue if you actually care about the kind of music that you're here to support. I think the same thing could be said of the norms of a scene. Like I said, when I show up at this, it's like, I don't really know these people. I don't really know how they do what, who's been here for how long, what they've been through. I'm a cultural outsider, even though I have some kind of a basis in all of this. I can't bring my norms and then just assume that they're going to be true in the scene. I have to get to know what they are. And as Žižek is going to show us, or is always keen on showing us, there is the explicit level of the norm, then there's the implicit level. Right? And most ideology critique happens at the level of explicit or implicit. But beneath all of that is the level of drive and jouissance, right? The kind of excitement, the kind of enjoyment that we get from messing things up, from self-undermining, from putting ourselves in harm's way, from disturbing what would otherwise be the smooth functioning of our harmonious life. Right? And in part, we need to have our outlets for our jouissance because we have drive, and our drive goes fucky because we live in a society where we can't do things. We can't do most of the things that we want to do. We don't have the time, we don't have the energy, we don't have the money, right? And so I want people to be thinking about the fact that there are rules, laws, but more importantly, norms, and that these change between spaces, and that different spaces get set up for different reasons, and that being unruly is one thing when it's actual rules or laws that are unjust or are perpetuating harm on people. It's another thing when your unruliness is just challenging norms for the sake of challenging norms, when those norms might actually be necessary for the maintenance and continuation of the scene itself. Certain kinds of behavior are not sustainable. Certain kinds of practices that certain people bring into certain spaces make the longevity of those spaces something that is, it's going to collapse. There's no future there, right? And that's why people say, no, fuck no, we can't have that here. And so, yeah, I just wanted to talk about how not all unruliness is really unruly. Sometimes it fundamentally goes against the norms of just any group that's trying to cope in a really fucked up society, and you're not even challenging the man, and it's ultimately a form of inherent transgression. Of course, I raised this question of, aren't we all just participating in inherent transgression? Maybe. But at the level of what's going on in the pit, though, being unruly against the norms of the scene, it's not really that rebellious. So, thank you.
All right. So, definitely there's, in what Dave was saying, something though that I was wanting to capture as well. But since Dave did, I'll just reference that. Pardon me. Yeah, okay. So I grew up in, moderately small town, so, removed from like some urban area. And, basically small business owners. My parents are small business owners. So, and then they sent me to a small private Christian school. It was, somewhat academically rigorous. There was some money there, but it wasn't like anything like prep school or anything outrageous. But in that context, and maybe in any other context too, but in that context, just felt like I didn't want to be a part of like consumerism, and it just was an aesthetic choice, or it was even somewhat moral, but it was just, there was something repulsive to me, even at, age 12, about people wearing Nike and Calvin Klein or whatever. So I just, came to it naturally. And probably part of it was that I just didn't fit in very well. I, pretty dorky. So I gravitated towards things like skateboarding, almost immediately brought me to punk music. And, like what Dave's describing in punk, there just was an ethic of rebellion even. And that just seemed like a good outlet for me. There was a good place for me to vent emotions, especially as my parents got a divorce. And there was a lot of things going on that, just even no matter what at that age, you've got a lot going on. So getting a part of a scene meant that I, found friends. Of course, we had stuff in common, and going to concerts, these small underground shows, felt like I had discovered something secret. And, of course, there's just a hip factor in feeling like you're a part of this avant-garde that is, on the cutting edge of something. Like I was the first in my high school to bleach my hair a ridiculous color, for example. And eventually this became political for me. It took years, but essentially it was punk music that brought me to the left. I just didn't have a political consciousness, and it was through Punk Planet magazine and different things like that, and listening to, of course, there's lots of punk music that has leftist lyrics, and it wasn't like an immediate thing, but I definitely ground my today's my politics that I'm at today in growing up in the punk scene. Eventually I started getting into literature as well, and other kind of countercultural stuff like Jack Kerouac, and it was through that I started to switch genres, if you will, or switch scenes. In punk, so like, mid to late 90s, selling out was like the primary fear or concern. Of course, this is the era of Green Day and Blink-182 and stuff like that, where punk was like breaking through to the mainstream in a way that, like, the question was, is it selling out to capitalism? Is it undermining true art? All of that kind of stuff. And that also came with this real, like, what's pure punk, and that fear of what is pure punk. I think I'll just note that it created this thing, like, we needed to look at like the Sex Pistols and replicate what they were doing for all eternity. And then it also created this real balkanization of punk music, so that everybody like was finding their micro group of punk, and saying that was the true definition of punk. And even when, like, I talk about getting into emo, so like I was, we had small garage concerts with names that became bigger, Braid, Jimmy Eat World even played in this garage. And it was something where it was interesting with Jimmy Eat World there, because they were actually already signed to a major label, but they were, small enough that they were just playing in a stupid garage. And I don't know, just that it was interesting to see how, like, once I joined the emo scene, and then it was like we were leagues away from the rest of the punk scene. In fact, just 2 nights ago, I went to a Gogo Bordello concert, and what was interesting is that we went with this friend who is like, a generation younger than me, and we got talking, realized that his dad was in the punk scene at the same time as what I'm describing, and he was listing off all of the the people and the bands that his dad had introduced him to when he was a kid, and like I knew none of them, and it was the same small town. Just to talk about how balkanized it was. But to move on, with emo is interesting because like emo like roots itself in something like Rites of Spring, which is like Keep It Chodo from Fugazi. 1984, it was just the epitome of what at the time was considered hardcore, but the a couple of features that moved in that different direction. Significantly, I was into a band called Jawbreaker. They had a song, the opening of it is "You're Not a Punk and I'm Telling Everyone," just is all about this him being a sellout, which then the next album was on a major label, which was interesting. And then Jawbreaker broke up, and then he formed Just Brazil, which kind of got grouped in with the emo scene. And because of his background, he was like 10 times more popular than the most popular emo band, just because of that history. And it was interesting how in 1998, when that Just Brazil album came out, and something with then the next year with Jimmy Eat World, Clarity, it just like radically transformed emo, and it became this thing that like no longer could fit in small garages. But okay, that focus on purity for me was tied into my politics. I voted for Ralph Nader in 2000. Even though the guy never had a chance to win, it was like this purity thing. And it's something I've wrestled with in my politics for, ever since. And probably the Bernie campaign of 2016 was the first time, not the first time I voted for somebody who could win, but voted in a way that it wasn't about some kind of purity choice. Instead, I started thinking about a mass politics. And I've really wrestled with growing up in the punk rock scene, and really kind of that avant-garde elitism, that like we're the small group that has found the truth, and then a mass politics where really I don't want that. Instead, what I want is a world where we can actually get shit done and help people. But then, thinking about how the reality of politics is that you need energy in order to get stuff done, and often that energy comes through an avant-garde. I think that this is, not that this is a whole conversation in and of itself, but I think that's what you see in Lenin, for example, is, that analysis of how you use an avant-garde in order to get stuff done. And then I think just the last thing I want to comment on is that, like, a lot of what Hegel is talking about is just kind of the dialectical process of history, and that really anytime you've got, an avant-garde, it's going to die. That energy is going to die from the beginning. The question is what that dialectical process looks like. Does it die without fundamentally transforming the structure of the system? Does it just get absorbed and co-opted, or can we take an avant-garde that can build, and in its dying and in its being absorbed into the system, fundamentally reshapes the paradigm, that kind of stuff. So as I said, I don't have any great insight or argument, but those are the things I've been thinking about, kind of in response to Dave's original lecture, and hopefully that's helpful. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Elton. And that's perfect that you didn't have it prepared, really. I told the presenters we're working our thoughts out towards things we'll probably, polish for other publications, or maybe for something that will come out of Theory Underground later. But with that, everyone put your hands together for Elton. Clap, clap, clap. And next we have up, who's next? George Dick. Welcome.
Right on, thanks. Yeah, that was great. I see a lot of connections in what both of you said. That's kind of what I was chewing on too. But before I start, I need to give a big shout out to Mikey for his blog, The Dangerous Maybe, because his essay on jouissance and wage labor was really important for me to think out, these ideas. So I feel like I'm the poser of the bunch. Like, my knowledge of hardcore is really limited. Like, I listen to death metal, black metal. I didn't go to shows growing up, and I don't mosh. And Lacan eludes me. I only get him indirectly through people who have spent meaningful time with the text. But I say this, I guess, more like to point out a form than content. Like, the poser is important to metal. It's like the quilting point. And metal defines itself by what it's not often. And I think jouissance is the secret sauce that kind of makes this community possible. But I also say you could feel free to call me out on not understanding Lacan. So in an interview with Sam Dunn, Rob Zombie shared his thoughts on metal. He said he never met the guy who is like Slayer, who said he was into Slayer for one summer. He only met the guy who's like Slayer carved into his chest or whatever. And his comment not only highlights, the supposed authenticity of the metalhead, but indirectly kind of points towards how posers aren't part of this community. He portrays the genuine metalhead as like an outsider, someone who doesn't really fit into conventional social norms. But then later on in the interview, a point that Zombie, I'm going to call him Zombie, stresses in the interview is his intense or insistence on theatrics in metal. And he says without it, he says you're just left with grunge, which for him is a very bad thing. Grunge is boring. But what he really seems to imply in the interview is the importance of, the fan getting what they paid for. Maybe getting an identity here. And Mark Fisher is obviously a person to bring in here, where I think where he would say Zombie misses the point of grunge, specifically Kurt Cobain, because Cobain knew that he was being bought and sold, and what's labeled as boring navel gazing is actually a performance of sort. He said, protesting MTV on MTV, and so Cobain's aware of his status as a commodity, and even how rebellion is commodified. But Zombie, on the other hand, doesn't seem to understand this feeling and wholeheartedly buys into like the commodification of identity with, his "you get what you pay for when you come to my shows." But it's kind of like begs the question, like, is it possible that, we're the poser if we're buying the identity by going to a concert? And I should probably talk about jouissance now. Lacan understands like jouissance as a form of excess enjoyment, something that functions beyond the pleasure principle. Maybe in a really simple way that is useful to me is when you turn pain into enjoyment. It can be expressed as like self-sabotage even, and it's tied to the death drive, this desire to repeat and find enjoyment in failure. And jouissance left unchecked can be really like socially destructive, but at the same time, it needs to be expressed because Lacan says it's like a fundamental part of human nature. And this expression of jouissance is necessary for communities to actually function. And this means the social identity is not just formed by following norms, but also through this like breaking, this rule breaking that's associated with jouissance. And so in like this discussion that follows, I'll try to see jouissance as an expression of this rule breaking that's necessary to sustain a community, specifically metal. So extreme metal has a natural connection with jouissance, I think, just at first blush, like sonically, lyrically, or physically. Metal's like this cacophonous, uninterpretable wall of sound that just like bowls you over the first time you hear it. It makes no sense. It's like noise, and the more time you spend with it, it turns into music. And then lyrically, it engages with, the macabre, death, desire. Jouissance itself is probably talked about. And an interesting part of extreme metal is like the failure to even understand what the vocalist is saying is almost like enjoyable. And then physically, it shows, as Dave talked about this, there's a clear expression of like in the pit. So just looking at typical metal culture, you can clearly make like a connection to jouissance, a failure, or like failure being turned into enjoyment, and metalheads are exercising this fundamental part of who they are, kind of. That's difficult otherwise in society. But, and as the other presenters have pointed out, metal has, or in their case, hardcore and punk, metal has its own set of social laws and norms that I think it also transgresses. And this goes back to Zombie's idea that metalheads are outsiders, and metal provides a place where outsiders can all be in community. So if you talk to your friendly neighborhood metalhead, they'll probably say, they'll give you this exact answer. So metal is always there for me, no judgment. I can finally be myself, authentic, these types of things. But then you ask their opinion of like Korn or Baby Metal or Demo Borgia, Portal, Death Heaven, or Knock Loose or whatever, and it becomes clear not all outsiders are welcome. And some of metal's own members are barred from participating in it. They're usually labeled, posers. And people get this, or metalheads get this excess enjoyment from breaking, the supposed community of the outsider. In other words, the big connection with jouissance here is that metalheads get pleasure from excluding members of their own community from the community. But ironically, this like transgressive act kind of helps form and create the metal community. And here, I think there's like this really, I don't know, there's a famous story of Metallica when on the Ride the Lightning, when they're touring Ride the Lightning, fans were like spitting and swearing at them, like at Hetfield, because Fade to Black had an acoustic guitar in it or something like that. And here you see like this excessive enjoyment of kicking someone out of the community because they're not authentic, metalheads. But Metallica is one of like the biggest metal acts at the time, and they like help establish thrash. But fans here were engaging with jouissance. Another interesting an interesting metal community on the internet is called Encyclopedia Metallum, or I'll just call it the Metal Archives. It was started in 2002. And it's a fan-made database with like 170,000 bands and almost the same number of album reviews on it. It's a weird, wonderful, and disturbing place, and it showed me a lot of my favorite artists. But it's also filled with metalheads, expressing the jouissance. I saw one user proclaim that metal died in 1993, and only 12 albums, that are actually metal had been released since then, and they're all recorded in 1993 anyway, so it doesn't really matter. This is a clear. It's clear these individuals have express enjoyment by writing these long form essays, giving this album 0 stars still. But compulsively returning to things they hate is like the self-sabotaging, is repetition of the pursuit of failure. And metal is a magnet for these types of expressions of like enjoyment. Like I myself kind of participate in this as well. But then back to Metal Encyclopedia, what bands actually get to be included? And there's like a little, the rule of thumb is all bands submitted to this site must be metal, and you have to prove to us that they're metal. Essentially saying that if it's a metal band, it's a metal band. It's like a tautology. But this is like an excess. Something's left unsaid. And the site has actually decided who's allowed on the site and who isn't ahead of time. There's like a blacklist in like the back end that if someone submits someone on this list, it's automatically rejected. But for the brave few who want to try to submit something, there's a guide outlining who gets to be in. So there's 4 points. The first point is for a band to be metal, it needs to have metal riffs, but doesn't really explain what a metal riff is. And to put riff at the heart of metal is kind of suspect. There needs to be a material existence for the metal, or like a recording. So it can't be like an idea of the band. Thirdly, this band needs to have at least one unambiguously metal album. Again, it doesn't really define what metal is. And finally, they give you a list of things that are not considered metal, and that is, things like new metal, metalcore, deathcore, these types of things. So, and the kind of irony is that these rules aren't really followed. There's like folk bands on the website, and usually the members of these folk bands are really sketchy, and there's even bands with like a 0 chorded presence. And I'm not saying these rules are wrong or anything, but they exist to prevent something, like to not allow the poser in, right? This is their function. And I can't help myself, but I want to retell the Žižek coffee joke, I'm sorry, sir, we don't have metal without breakdowns, but we do have metal without rap. So shout out to the rap panel later. Which I think brings us to another interesting thing, and it's the phenomenon of band merch or clothing. It's worth bringing up. The rule is that if you didn't go to the show, or you can't name an arbitrary amount of songs off an album, then you can't wear the shirt. There's even videos of people calling out fake fans, outraged at a Kardashian wearing a Cannibal Corpse sweater or whatever. And Jason Bernstein brought to my attention that this could be connected with the phenomenon of stolen valor. So this is where there exist military imposters, mostly in the States, who are individuals that lie about military service or wear uniforms and awards in public to kind of like garner respect. And this is kind of what the metalhead experience is, calling out the stolen metal valor, and there's an enjoyment in this behavior. And this is connected with the theft of enjoyment. For the metalhead, this is the poser is a theft of enjoyment. And in his essay, Mikey, that I talked about earlier, uses Žižek to connect the theft of enjoyment to wage labor and jouissance. And the idea is that the other is stealing my enjoyment, which is something Žižek developed to explain how racism emerges in communities, and like a disgust with how the other, is enjoying the stolen thing. They would find it like annoying or disgusting or just like not right. Žižek has a handful of examples that I'm sure you can think of, but he highlights that this theft of enjoyment is really dealing with the trauma or feeling that we never had the enjoyment to begin with, and that the other is actually capable of enjoying it more than us. I think this is particularly present in metal because the poser here is stealing the identity of metalheads. But metal itself can't positively define what it is, only by what it's not. And the poser is stealing something that was never really nailed down. But the fear is that they could have like a fuller enjoyment of it. So this kind of brings me to my last thought, and it's connecting this theft of enjoyment and this darker side of jouissance. And it's evident that like metal regrettably harbors elements of racism among like bands and its followers, which is like too frequent to be random, which gets us to ask, why does this exist? I think it's because metal puts such an emphasis on the theft of enjoyment by posers, and racist groups are drawn to the genre because they can graft their projects onto this psychic phenomenon. And it's the same mechanism. So, and like I don't think any amount of education, cancellation aimed at these fans and musicians will like stop this systemic reoccurrence of racism in metal. And I think the most like effective solution here is related to the way that the metal community views posers and authenticity. So like maybe if metalheads were more in tune with the abyssal core of metal identity and how there's really nothing to be stolen, I think racism would have a much harder time like taking root in metal, and I would think it'd be far less frequent. So yeah, that's about it for me. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, George. Great job. That was fantastic. And then we're gonna have it'll go Bryce Nance and then Jason Myles.
All right. So I was going to try to write something, and that was titled at the time Rather Be Dead, which is the title of a song by Refused, which is a Swedish hardcore band. And they're a really good band, and there's a lot of problems with them, but they're a really good band, and I think everybody should go give Refused a listen. But I was working through some contradictions, and for whatever reason, I latched on to H2O, which is a New York hardcore band, and I was kind of contrasting Dennis Luxian, the frontman of Refused, and Toby Morse, the frontman of H2O. And I was going to try to do something there because I think there's some interesting contradictions with them. H2O has always been really like retrospective. Like even back in the early 90s, they were singing songs about how the scene used to be. Whereas Refused has always been really forward looking, and I think they've done a lot more for the scene in general than they get credit for, but maybe not. I don't know. And then I kind of went down and just couldn't do anything but find other contradictions. Because I'm trying to like identify what is punk rock, what is hardcore, What is it? Because it's never defined. It's never, no one ever comes out and says it. Like we all just pretend it's this thing, kind of like metal. Like it's just this thing that we all know what it is, but we know it when we see it. And so I was thinking some interesting contradictions or interesting figures that present contradictions I find interesting are Bradley Nowell and Kurt Cobain. That's Sublime and Nirvana. I think there's some interesting tension there. Pat the Bunny or Pat Schweenis, he's a folk punk guy from Arizona who probably no one knows. And then SZA from Leftover Crack. I think they're some interesting stuff. And then Chris Hanna of Propagandy and Fat Mike. I think there's some interesting stuff. And then Ian MacKaye and Henry Rollins are very interesting to me. I think Ian MacKaye is the one true punk rocker. If anybody ever did punk rock ever, Socrates, Norman Finkelstein, and Ian MacKaye. And then Henry Rollins is like the MTV version of that. Penny Rimbaud of Crass, who for me, like the dirty gutter punk, crust core, nasty guy, Crass was the shit. And then there's Marshall McLaren, is the dude who designed the Sex Pistols. And I think if you're into punk rock, you know who the Sex Pistols are, and you should be aware of the fact that they were the MTV version before MTV. And Crass was also kind of just PMC douchebags, but at least they were chasing something. I think, like I think they believed in the art. I think they were actually trying to do something. And then a more contemporary, I guess, example is Max Bemis of Say Anything, and Ronnie Radke of whatever his project is now.
Whatever that is.
But I actually think Max Bemis and Ronnie Radke, I don't think they're as at odds as they might seem on the surface. I think they're both innovators, and I think they're both doing really interesting shit. And I think they both believe in what they're doing. But so my mind's been all over the place. That's what I've been working out, is trying to identify contradictions. And just kind of come to some agreement as to what is punk rock, what is hardcore. Because it's fun to talk about and it's fun to like pontificate, but I don't really know what it is. I spent probably decades in one way or another identifying myself as a punk rocker, or always in reference to, oh yeah, I used to be a punk rocker. Like, yeah, I used to this, I used to that. Or I'll refer to myself, oh yeah, I'm just a crusty old, crusty old punker. But I don't know what that means. And that kind of gets to this idea of authenticity. And I think it's always impossible in the first place. And the majority of the time, scenes turn into nothing but commercial relationships between consumers and outlets. And even if I buy an album from Ian MacK, like there's still that's the end of it. Like I get to listen to a little bit of music, have a little bit of fun. He gets $12 or whatever. And that's all she wrote. But there is something there. Like there's something at the core of art that can't really be put into language, because it's sound, it's shapes, it's feelings, it's things that we don't have words for. And maybe that's because we don't need words for them, or maybe that's because they resist language in some way. And I'm not sure about that either. That's kind of what I've been thinking about. I do think art, maybe not necessarily, but I do think it can serve as a strong foundation for movements. We can all identify to art. We can all relate to art in a way that, again, that maybe we aren't able to put in words, but we can't deny, like, oh, I feel a certain way when I hear these sounds, or I feel a certain way when I see those shapes or those colors. And from there, when we're able to like set aside our aesthetic or our apparent surface level differences, and we can relate, and I can look at you and you can look at me, and we can be like, yeah, we get it. And then that can kind of serve as a ground upon which we can work together to build like collective movements and shit like that. And we definitely need to come together and work on movements. And then I was wondering, is art political? When I was younger, that was a big thing. Like, part of being punk rock was like, yeah, it's about the message. It's about, believing in something bigger than yourself. But NoFX has made 14 albums about politics, and they're like, they just keep making the same albums and keep playing the Warped Tour and keep selling beer and keep making fun of, dudes I used to work with. Like, all they do is make fun of racist truck drivers, and that's not really cool. That's not real politics. But it was important. Like, if it wasn't explicitly political, and even, I mean, when I was younger, I don't know if we had the self-awareness to call it left wing. I mean, we all called ourselves anarchists, but I think we presupposed a lot there. I don't think anybody really understood. People would still look at you weird if you were actually reading a book, because it was about the music. It was about getting fucked up and having unprotected sex and like doing drugs and just being more punk than the next guy. But we all still pretended like, yeah, this is political. This is real in some way. So does art have to be political? But then there's also, is art ever anything but political? Like, I also kind of believe that art is always political, because everything is always implicitly political, because it's always in response to the world around us, in response to our material conditions. We're always trying to say something. And a lot of the times we get in our own way. We sabotage our own attempts at communication by trying to fit it into inauthentic boxes. Yeah. And again, like, I'm all over the place, and I'm really just trying to work out what the fuck is punk or hardcore or art or whatever. Earlier in the day, we were talking about what is underground, what makes something underground versus mainstream. And yeah, unless we take the time to have like considered conversations about it, we're always going to be talking past each other, and it's always just going to be signaling to one another like, yeah, I'm more punk than you. Yeah, I've read more books about communism than you. Yeah, I'm more awesome than you. And that sucks. And I want to find a way to use, I guess, like the entry level belonging, sense of community, collectivity, whatever it is, and actually use that to build projects that last and propagate themselves into the future. And yeah, and I'm done.
Thanks, Nance. I think that this is like the one of the innovative things that we're doing with Underground Theory is that we give the presentation before we write the piece that later gets published, right? Because normally people, they all go to the conference, assume that one another has like read the piece when no one actually has, and then you all talk about it, right? And so instead it's like, no, let's all talk, kind of see where we're all coming from, think for a few months, write about it, then we'll talk again once we've all read what we've written, right? So I like that you and Elton and like that you're like, yeah, no, we're just trying to figure it out. This is what I'm thinking through, and so thanks for helping me keep the standard lowered in this regard. Obviously, we want to raise the standard in other regards, but when it comes to this one, err on the side of not overproduced, I say. But with that, it's going to be Jason Myles, and then we'll turn to the panel discussion. So please put your hands together, metaphorically or literally, for Jason Myles.
Thank you. I did prepare something because I've been nervous about this thing for no good reason since Dave mentioned it to me. Both hip hop and hardcore, heavy music, mean a lot to me. They shape the way I see the world. I was lucky enough to do both of them at some professional level. So I want to thank you again for having me on, and I'm very honored to be on this panel of people because I really appreciate what you guys have said. I have so many comments I want to add to the topics that you guys presented. And I'll be really brief. I want to talk a little bit about kind of, many people have talked about like what is a certain genre of music, and I don't know if I'm really here to define those things. I think there's certain sonic qualities to definitely certain genres of music. But I'm just going to kind of talk about a moment in my life that made me say, I think I want to be this thing because it's cool. I remember watching excerpts of an interview with the Sex Pistols and like a motley entourage of punks on PBS, where the interviewer was being particularly smug and condescending to the group, who I might add was also being a bit garish in their own right. Once the interviewer made an offensive comment to one of the crew, Johnny Rotten and Steve Jones went on a 4-letter tirade with cameras rolling. That 4-letter explosion at a well-respected TV host was one of the most rebellious things I had seen in my young 11 or so years of life, reality TV before it was in vogue. It was at that moment that I decided I was a punk rocker. I wanted to have that level of courage and brashness to simply thumb my nose at buttoned up conservative authority. It was the 80s after all. It was the 80s. The Reagan reigned supreme in the US and Thatcher in the UK, and they were both going to bring in the conservative revolution. The hippies had finally lost and accepted the fact that the seclusion of middle-class security was better than hand-to-mouth commune living. The People's Rebellion was crushed by easy credit, shopping malls, and cable TV. But a sonic rumble would be heard around the world in the form of hardcore punk. But what was it really about? Was it really about challenging the power structure, or, as many people have said kind of on this panel, simply saying no to the demands of the conservative milieu? The speed, dissonant harshness, and violence of hardcore was set against the musical backdrop of the arrogance of overbloated rock and roll that had turned into a parody of its gluttonous success and the cocaine-soaked decadence disco. The sound of hardcore was the sound, for many, of a rebellious middle finger. Its look was uninviting and scary to some outsiders. The musicians might have lacked Van Halen-like virtuosity, but they made up for it with an anarchistic charm. But why didn't this movement build its own infrastructure beyond its small, loyal fan base? Were these artists truly outsiders to the mainstream, or were they just kind of a newer version of garage rockers of previous generation, this time with more attitude? If I could point out some of the simple failures of this musical moment, people might say, what do you mean failures? It still exists. It does, but not much has changed. It's still a very image-based genre. Much like punk, sounds for the art house, where your perceived image is more important than the sonic quality of what you do musically. The culture of authenticity calls for artists to be real punks. But what does that mean? Most of the early hardcore groups of the 80s Southern California scene didn't come from the gritty streets of Watts or Compton, but from the suburbs of Orange County and Los Angeles County. While deindustrialization and neoliberalism was stripping away opportunity, these folks were attempting to find stardom in their musical endeavors, not revolution. Fame, fortune, maybe on their terms, but they saw the perceived success of their British counterparts and wanted the same. So was hardcore more of a cottage industry formed by people that didn't have an entry into the mainstream? And if so, who is the poser? That is the question I ask.
All right. Thank you so much, Jason. We have about 40 minutes here to discuss one another's presentations and to take questions from the audience. I'm going to be listening with my headphones as I go get a fly swatter because this thing keeps buzzing up into my face and I can't get it to stop. So let's just kind of just for now do free for all until it feels like you can't really get a word in edgewise, which is a good sign. That's a good sign that people are actually getting something from the conversation, and it's and that's just when you use the little hand raise feature that comes with Zoom. So for now though, free for all.
How do I raise my hand? Because I want to ask George a question.
So you go down to the little thing. I guess is it the more where it says more, the three dots?
More? Okay, sorry.
You go to reactions. You just click
That's how
reactions.
old I am. Like an old person with a digital camera in 2002.
Yeah.
Where's the flash on this thing?
Nance and George, you guys can just unmute and hang out. Sorry. Cool. Thanks.
I did want to bring something up to George. It's okay.
Yeah.
In talking about racism and this music, I do find it interesting. Also talking about like the culture of authenticity. One thing that to me is interesting about punk, hardcore, and metal is that these genres of music really are born out of white suburbia and don't really come off the back of black music, much like maybe the way we look at what we call classic rock now. You know, if we think about things like Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, and the Beatles, this is all black music with European sensibilities, right? This is what they were getting from the soldiers that were stationed overseas. And heavy metal has nothing to do with that. And I kind of don't like when I see people do these things like, well, this is all stems from, Delta blues. It's like, no, it's not coming from Delta blues. Maybe the people that inspired them,
right,
but not them themselves. So when I think about hardcore music, or even kind of like the first wave of American metal, not so much the British stuff, but American metal, it really is a suburban, working class, more so with metal, working class, white dominated genre that isn't very heterogeneous. When you look at the first waves of bands that come through, a lot of people look the same. It's almost like if your hair is a certain texture, then you are okay, to be in this realm. And it is interesting that you talked about nu metal, because that is the one moment, and I don't know if people will agree on this, where we start seeing kind of a cross-pollination sonically, because MTV becomes the norm. So you literally have people that grew up on MTV, which was hip hop and R&B and rock and European pop music. There's all these different things that we're watching 24 hours a day, and it's definitely influencing the sound. And we're a big fan. Some of it was actually interesting. You really do get a new sound, right? But there is this backlash that is so racist. And when you say that, some people are like, no, it's not racist. I'm like, well, yeah, it is. And you know, you said you're a fan of black metal, and I understand everybody listens to black metal isn't a Nazi, but a lot of Nazis listen to black metal.
Yeah.
It's still 50 years later or whatever, a white dominated genre. And all this stuff is very image based. So whenever you do have different things in the female fronted bands, or even all female bands, or even gay bands or black bands, that's the selling point, right? What is your take about identity in all these music, and kind of like this liberal identity that we want in it, to the point where now we do see more groups that have token members of different marginalized identity groups, but they really don't say much beyond kind of the normal, can't we all just get along? And I'll take my answer off there.
Mm-hmm. So that's great. Thanks. Yeah. I think this kind of ties into some of the things that Dave talked about in his essay that kind of pitched this this talk, where it was talking about affinity groups, and he's got the flash water, and how it's a lot of it is like affinity group, I think, as David defines it, is like it's a group of people. It's like a consumer kind of identity where you join to kind of feeling community with someone or with a group of people, and they exist. These interactions are kind of on a superficial level and doesn't really incorporate difference into the community at all. And as a result, there's not a lot of like these really deep conversations maybe about topics. And I saw that as a connection to a bit of my talk with Mr. Zombie and his you go to the show and you get to be a metalhead. You get to kind of cosplay, whatever, and yeah, this kind of consumer identity. And then he just didn't really get the whole grunge's kind of sadness and this kind of like running up against the difficulties of participating in these communities and how it doesn't really feel authentic. Yeah, I think maybe, Dave's talking about his affinity groups and then the intellectual milieu kind of thing. That might be a good idea to kind of talk more about this topic on, if that makes sense.
I mean, the first wave of hardcore is pretty racist. We have to admit that some of these bands that I'm a mild fan of didn't say some nice things even when the cameras were rolling. They just didn't care, and that kind of plays into the attitude, because also I think this music that we're all fans of, it's really also part of the culture of deconstruction, which for me is kind of the culture of no. It's really all they were really doing was just saying no. let's remember, for those that are old enough to remember, like conservatism was so popular that, one of the best running shows was a show called Family Ties, where the star of the show is the conservative Reagan loving son. And the punchlines were thrown at his hippie parents. They were the silly idealistic people, and he was the smart guy. Polo shirts had won. And it's an interesting time for me to think back on, because I look at it and then I think about 1994. I think there's like these important years, right? 1984 is an important year for hardcore music because that scene is a middle finger to Reagan. Like, it's literally pointing its finger at Ronald Reagan and saying, you're the problem and we're going to topple you. Every flyer is a picture of Reagan with a bullet in his head, Reagan sucking a dick. It's just, whatever we can do to F Reagan. In 1884, he wins by a landslide, right? And that scene kind of, I don't want to say goes off the rails, but it definitely goes into some dark places after that. Some people just leave altogether, drug addiction. There's just all these reasons why that scene. But 84 for a lot of people was a year of defeat that were in that scene. And then you have 1994, 10 years later, which is also kind of a pivotal year too, for those that are old enough to remember, because that's the death of Kurt Cobain. And coincidentally, it's the year that Green Day's Dookie comes out. And we get this term called pop punk. And it's also around the time that we're starting to see a lot of financial deregulation. So credit becomes easier to obtain for young people. Record stores and malls, the blow up of the suburbs, right? We're seeing all these things happen around this time and following, and you get the blow up of this kind of like mall music. It's got the look and the look of danger that punk rock had, but it's sugary sweet songs about farts and heartbreak. And the Warped Tour is also an interesting time because some of the first wave bands that didn't have financial success are able to get a second life through the Warped Tour. And now they have endorsements. There's Hot Topics. So they have licensing deals for their merchandise, which have become iconic. So the stuff that we held dear, the shirts that we know, the Flipper shirt is a shirt Kurt Cobain made. And he just made it because he liked the band. They didn't sell it. You couldn't get it.
That's good.
But that then becomes a thing. All these, the Dick Kennedys, Black Flag, Minor Threat, all these bands now you can just go to the mall and get, and next to it you can get your Anarchy t-shirt and your pre-ripped jeans. I have Rebellion packaged for you. And what always kind of tripped me out about these moments is like these are kind of moments where these movements kind of sort of died out. And maybe us that are fans of it projected onto it more than it was. Maybe we always wanted them to be more than they were. Look, man, I grew up listening to those first 5 Metallica records and Megadeth records and Slayer records to the point where it's so ingrained on my DNA. I know the end songs on side 1, and Disposable Heroes is the first song on side 2 of Master of Puppets. You know what I'm saying? Like I know that music, and I thought that these guys were like true rebel, and then I got to meet them, and I'm like, oh, that is as far left as I thought. This is interesting, and it definitely made me reevaluate the importance that maybe I placed on this stuff. And the same could be said for hip hop. I'll get to talk about that later, but it's interesting to hear everybody's take, because I think we all come from a similar place of we're listening to this music all around the same time that we're maturing into understanding the world, or maybe even getting into politics of some kind. Some of these bands that we listen to, especially bands like Crass, they're very, very political. And when we saw that anarchy sign, that we knew that was something more important than just fuck you, mom. But did it really mean something more important than fuck you, mom?
I want to say, like, going off of what you've both been saying, when George initially told me what he was thinking about talking about, I got really excited because that was kind of the first place I'd gone to and thinking about kind of connections between scenes, emerging media scenes online, and past stuff that I've done, right? It's this idea of the jouissance that comes at not just releasing yourself in the pit or in the moment, or pushing yourself, or listening to something that really pushes things sonically, like to the point where it just sounds like noise, and it actually takes a lot to, okay, this is the music here, and that there's actual lyrics. Who knew, right? the part that, like, that was where I started thinking, but then I was like, well, no, but jouissance often comes more at, like, that feel, I think in this case a lot, the feeling of I get it, they don't, and there is a jouissance that comes from that, and it both with the online left as well as with any music scene. You get a lot of people who did not do well in high school, who, some of whom they never want to think about that kind of thing again. They couldn't care less. They're just there to have fun. But other people, they're trying to recreate their high school experience, but now they want to be the cool person, right? And you always see how this kind of stuff emerges around certain bands, around certain houses that like to have shows or parties, or there's different cliques that form, right? And the analogy here is that the affinity group is a clique, right? And there's nothing wrong with cliques. There's nothing wrong with affinity groups. Ultimately, we want it to be more than that is the issue. And so I think one of the interesting things about thinking about drive, like as an ideological component, is like outside of the explicit and implicit political ideological content or lack thereof, there's just always this I get something from being the kind of person who listens to a kind of music who, when other people overhear it, they go, oh. And there's like that feeds you, like in a sort of sense. And it gives you a sense of belonging that you were lacking. Hold on, somebody mute. Somebody should mute. I don't know who it is, but it's very loud. Might be, I'm not sure who it is, but somebody, it's kind of windy for somebody. So just mute until you get into a place that's not windy. Thank you. Now, I don't want to hog too much space here. I want everyone else to be able to participate. Please be raising your hands at this point. Like, I would like to see some people ask the presenters questions. I know that there's some people in the audience, some people who might have never been involved in any of this stuff, and other people who might be old veterans. And I want you to have all of you to have opportunities to ask Jason, Nance, George. Elton is also still here, so you can all ask Elton questions still. But yeah. I guess I've just been thinking a lot about all of that, and Jason, I think your question about identity and all of this is really interesting. And of course, the music scene after the time that I kind of got into other things in life, because that used to be everything I cared about, and that's all I cared about. But after I got into other things, that's kind of when like the sort of pseudo woke bullshit kind of infiltrated the scene. It became a big thing, and that's kind of what you're talking about with this, like, oh, but here's a band with a woman in it, and here's, oh, look, it's an all black band. Oh, great, it's like, but what is that, right? And one of the things that I was wondering is, like, it's interesting that rock, though it was appropriating from black culture, was nonetheless it was white, right? As far as people saw through their televisions and heard through their radios, identified with it as like a white thing. and that rap, as like the above ground version of hip hop, was obviously like sold as like this black thing. And it's interesting that the countercultures or little niche consumer demographics that set themselves in opposition to that mainstream mirror that aspect of it. And so it becomes, I guess I'm wondering, well, I don't really know what I'm wondering, but it's interesting that it's kind of mirroring that, because obviously it's like, oh, well, we listen to something that's kind of like rock, but way more crazy or way harder. But it's still just a white thing. As opposed to, I'm really curious to see how you all theorize the relation between mainstream rap and underground hip hop and all of that. But I don't know. I think it's a really interesting thing, because class factors in here in a pretty heavy way, because one is a reaction to the boomer dad who goes to rock concerts, who used to be a hippie, and you're like, oh no, but I'm way harder than that, right? And that's a middle class thing, as opposed to what Dr. Adolf Reed critiques as, this underclass idea, is obviously the idea a lot of people kind of have in mind when they're thinking about rap and hip hop, which is obviously racialized. And so I can't turn that into a question, Jason. I thought it would come, but I don't really know. I just kind of.
I have something to add to that. I mean, yeah. I think there's a moment in the early days of hip hop and punk rock where they're both kind of existing in high society. These are bourgeois music genres that we don't want to believe are, but they are. There's a great movie. I think it's a great movie. F you if you don't like it. It's called Less Than Zero. And Rick Rubin, a man that I think is massively overrated, did do a great job of putting that soundtrack together. And when you watch this movie about extremely rich people being kind of not as debaucherous as they are in the book, but every time they go to a party, even if it's a house party, there's a valet there to park their car, which I thought was kind of funny. To kind of give you an idea of how rich these people are supposed to be. But they're listening to hip hop, and they're listening to punk, and they're listening to metal. These were kind of the genres that were played for elite circles. When Blondie does their rap song, that's what, like 1980? That's not Fab Five Freddy in the video, by the way, too. That's Basquiat. But Fab Five Freddy was friends with those people. I got to work on a kids' TV show, the live show of a kids' TV show called Yo Gabba Gabba. Part of that kids' TV show was a seminal figure of hip hop, a guy named Biz Markie. And we got to know each other very well. One of the nicest people in the history of nice people. Very, very helpful man. And one day I asked him about that video. And he was like, fucking know what you're talking about. That was Freddie. He's like, Freddie hung with those people in Manhattan. We were doing our hip hop thing, but Freddie was out there doing the rap thing for those people, which I always found interesting when he said that, because it kind of showed that, he was trying to give legitimacy to this genre. And that's where you got your legitimacy, when people looked at you as like high art. And that's why metal to this day doesn't have a certain kind of legitimacy, because it's not high art. And there's friends bands that I know that, we jokingly call hipster metal. I'm talking about, George. A buddy of mine, basically anything Aaron Turner touches. But because it gets a certain kind of review in a certain place, then it's important. And we looked at this music, again, be it Public Enemy, Dancing with Toy Guns, or, Lydia Lunch screaming into a microphone. Someone said it was important. Ergo, then we said it was important. And I think this is something that it's sometimes hard for us to digest, because these genres of music sometimes can be like the way we see our politics. And hopefully we don't want our politics to be like our little niche clique of cool kids. You know, we want them to be for everybody to digest, but sometimes it just comes off that way. And that's a problem, I think.
This is Elton, and if I may, I have read Less Than Zero. I haven't seen the movie, but I know at a young age I loved the fact that I was like reading a book that was talking about the bands that I listened to and loved. And then, you know, with time, I learned about class analysis and thought it was, you know, interesting that these are the elite, the most wealthy who have access to all the economic resources that are listening to music that's, you know, at least kind of sold as, but I think often like Sex Pistols and you know, British punk music of the 70s often was associated with the working class. Like that's actually where the musicians came from. Joy Division, you know, the whole scene there in Manchester and stuff. And I also love like the specials, so like ska, where what's interesting is that it's like working class music that is explicitly anti-racist. It's, you know, they like the skinhead movement even was originally just a part of that punk ska scene, and it was over time that it morphed into its own genre of kind of racist, explicitly like fascist music. But I think that it's fair to say that it was, at least in the early days, like very working class, that was part of the identity of the music, even if it wasn't socialist or something like that. It was still at least very working class consciousness, and that part of it getting consumed into mainstream culture was the fact that it was avant-garde, and it's the elite, you know, it's the 1%, of course, who, especially at that era when we didn't have the internet and media was such that it was, that they were able to, you know, find the avant-garde music and then popularize it in a way that wasn't done well. Like, even while we're talking about ska, pardon me for one more moment, just that a lot of ska in England, so second wave ska in the 70s, was even people getting access to records from Jamaica of the 50s and 60s. And they, you know, consciously recognized it as like kind of like blues and stuff like that, whereas it's like, this is music of the oppressed, and that it was even a political act for, you know, punks of England to adopt it. But then, of course, you know, we know Sex Pistols, they like, even on their first album, I think we're getting like #1, you know, chart topping hits, and, you know, Coming to America. So it was immediately from the beginning becoming, you know, a sold out mainstream thing, if you will. Obviously there's more nuance there, but okay, I just wanted to add some of those comments. I've really enjoyed this, everybody involved, and props to Refused. They're great. So thanks, Nance.
The more I see Jason nodding his head to Elton saying props to Nance for Refused, the more I go, God damn, I really need to listen to Refused a lot more. But I did start listening to them like within the last month, thanks to Nance, and I was like, why haven't I listened to them before? They're fucking badass. But with that said, Sean has his hand up. Go for it, man.
Here, I'll turn my camera on so you can see me a little bit. Jason Myles, I'm happy to see. I'm a pretty regular listener to TIR, so I just want to say that. I just wanted to piggyback after, who was the last person who just went?
Elton.
I just wanted to piggyback off of that because I put something in the link about It Did Happen Here, the podcast about anti-racism in Portland in the 80s and versus the Nazi boneheads, as the anti-racist skinheads would call them. And so it's pretty interesting that in that case you kind of see some music being like a way to cohere a community, but there being something more substantively political about it, because it's totally intertwined with anti-racist action and fighting Nazi boneheads who killed people in Portland at that time, so it's a really good podcast. It's done by people who were there, and so yeah, that's pretty cool. But it's I don't know, it's interesting that that there can be a political movement around music, sort of cohered by music, but music itself, I don't think is never necessarily political, but it can be used as a way to form a community around which, and then that community can be political or not. But anyway, yeah.
Oh, thanks, Sean. I don't know how you guys feel, and I want to ask everybody this question. A big reason why I do what I do has a lot to do with the shelter-in-place orders and everything kind of shutting down. And we were about to do a tour of the Northwest when everything shut down, and I got to do this, way more seriously, to the point where the band is kind of done. But I do miss a certain sense of community with live performances. There's nothing like being around people and sharing that moment. And I think that is the one thing about these genres of music that are a little different than even mass gatherings that you see, because I worked at music festivals for so long, is that it feels more intimate. Maybe because the music hasn't blown up hip hop has to a certain degree, but I think the stuff that we're talking about is not really arena size music. Maybe theater at best. Some of these artists that we really like are, and there's something so intimate and communal about these spaces. I got to go on tour with the band called Godflesh in 2014, and what blew me away about that tour was the people I would see in the crowd. I had never seen such a cross-pollination of dudes that look like ravers, the hipster metal guys that look so cool, goth cats. They all came out to these shows and had such a good time. It's like, man, I'd so miss those moments of sharing that space with people. And then you see someone with a shirt, like, oh, that dude's wearing a Christian Death shirt. Let me go fucking holler at that dude. Maybe we got something in common. And you make a friend. You know what I mean? I miss that. I don't know if you guys feel the same.
I do miss that a lot. Yeah. I went to a show the other day, and I thought it was going to be just like a standard hardcore show of sorts. I thought I'd see a bunch of old faces because I'm up visiting my parents, and so I'm in that neck of the woods, and so I went to my old stomping grounds like a week after going to a different show where I did see everybody, but I didn't really look closely at the poster or think about it. But this was totally just like a different scene. It's like different people. It was like sounded so similar, but it was just a literally different scene. It was more it was heavy metal, like really, really heavy metal. But I just kind of assumed that, oh yeah, it's probably some deathcore shit or something. And it wasn't. And so when I went, I was like, I was more of an observer, right? Like if it was a bunch of people I knew and it was like my old scene and stuff, I would have gone in there and gotten a bunch of hugs and kind of hung out in the pit, and there'd be this reunion moment. Instead, I'm kind of just like, oh, I guess I'm just gonna sit up here and kind of watch what's going on, you know, because it's these other people's thing. And there I was, one of the things that I was really pleased about was like that pit for these bands. It was mostly moshing, but these people were so full of love, and you know, you could tell that some of them had been around for a while and had made friendships and stuff like that. And so I was kind of watching as like an outsider, kind of taking on that anthropological perspective. And I was just like, this is fucking bass though. I'm really pleased to see that they're still doing this, because the first time I ever went to a show like that, you know, way before I got into core and everything, that was like the thing that I immediately felt was like, oh, okay. I was naive, but I was just like, there's no one's judging anybody here. Like the initial thing you experience in a mosh pit is like, oh, we're all here to have fun and get our aggression out, but we don't fucking hate each other, and it's just welcoming, and I just really like that feeling at a metal show. Now I'm going to segue that into something that touches on what George said and touches on something Jason said, and this will be my final remarks for this panel portion, and then I want everyone else to kind of say their closing thoughts, and then it's over, right? But basically, we're going to be doing the critical media theory reflection here in a little bit, and that's the thing that's between this event and the hip hop panel. But I'll just say that it is kind of crazy that you can find so much belonging and love, and definitely a lot of people who've got no patience for that kind of judgment, so long as you're there, so long as you show that you're into it. But of course, like if you were to oust yourself as an outsider, or like you listen to other things or something, a lot of the people that are so open could also really quickly be pretty closed off to you. And I was thinking about how Jason was saying, we obviously don't want, like, it's not political to just have a little friend group online that you have a bunch of like your own little unique norms, your own little ways of resisting the mainstream, but then you want to impose those on the mainstream society and you call that your politics, right? But considering the fact that most people who got into anarchism and socialism that I know got into it because of this kind of hyper exclusionary music that requires a mainstream that it stands in opposition to, I just have to think that there's something about the new left and its ethos that is inherently insular, inherently folk political, to use the term that Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams use in their whatever the book was called, their accelerationist book about inventing the future. That's what it was called.
Inventing the future.
Thank you. Yeah, that folk political kind of aspect of it, it makes sense because people are getting into politics because they're marginalized. It makes sense because they also get into it through music that's made to be marginal. And so how can that translate into a mass movement, right? It's recently Doug Lane from Sublation Media said on his Twitter that most of these people who are leftists today were scene kids yesterday, and they'll be into something new pretty soon. And I tried to dig up the tweet so I could share that on the screen, but I couldn't find the tweet. But he was mirroring something that Benedict CryptoFash had said on Twitter months before him. And I'd already started Underground Theory at that point. And so I was already thinking, yeah, that's why I called this Underground Theory, is because the point is I was like a left tube influencer of sorts. And then I realized, oh, this is just another scene. And I'm just like a one-man band in a new scene. That's basically what's going on here. We say things. It doesn't mean anything, though, because ultimately, these are signifiers of belonging, not signifiers of, oh, we're going to actually change things. And we actually care about reaching the disaffected, reaching the disenfranchised, reaching people who aren't represented by any of these little niche consumer demographics. And so, and Michael Downs just joined. He's here for the next panel. And it was out of the conversations I've had with Mikey that we really realized, yeah, it's an emerging scene. There's a lot of these scene kid kind of tendencies being reproduced. And then as time has gone on, especially after this conversation, I just have to say, like, it does seem like the norms of leftism itself, as it has existed since the 60s, and through the 70s, from hippies through punk, those norms have developed with all the contradictions that we're talking about here that are applicable to the music that we're talking about. But they also all of those kind of critiques and contradictions, that all seems to map perfectly onto the political situation. And for anybody who was involved with Bernie, who thought, yeah, that's great, it's like a mass working class focused politics, that's great. If you were really involved with it, if you really knocked doors, if you really made a lot of phone calls, and if you really were around a lot of other people, the people on the ground were fucking amazing. And they usually weren't these people who have like these hyper niche identities that they got online or from some specific genre of music. They're not trying to be influencers. They're just people who want Medicare for all, right? And so you get a lot of different people, and maybe they have some niche consumer. Maybe they're really into Deadpool or something, and they got all these stickers all over their car. It doesn't mean that they're letting that get in the way of their politics, but it's only people who are really into these specific things that seem to kind of bring that same energy into politics. And those people do dominate the media left. And so I think that's just something to think about. But everyone else, say your closing thoughts, and then we'll close this one out and do the next segment. Thank you.
This is Elton. I'll go real quick because I just want to follow up to that I think there possibly is some hope, although my example is a terrifying example, so I apologize. But Gramsci, I have the Gramsci podcast. I don't think I did an episode on the futurists, but there's an art movement that came from Italy, turn of the century, and essentially it was an avant-garde art movement. It was fundamentally about like being jarring and agitating people. In fact, I mentioned the band Rites of Spring, the original Rites of Spring. I'm not sure if it was actually a part of the futurist movement, but the point was that it was this classical music concert that was so jarring that it like literally started a riot when it happened. But in Italy, the futurists actually became a part of the fascist movement. So again, it's a terrible example, but it's just to say that avant-garde was actually a part of something that became a mass movement, obviously the wrong movement. But I think you see the same thing in Germany with the Nazis as well, that Hitler was able to incorporate the avant-garde, but then he turned on the avant-garde, and I think the same thing happened in Italy as well. So keep that in mind too. So, all right, this has been great. Thanks.
I can go next. Yeah. On the topic of, Jason, you mentioned the shirts. I've met so many like friends just by like wearing like a Opeth shirt or something. Oh, we could talk about that album. Oh, that album sucks. Whatever. And like I've made so many friends that I wouldn't have otherwise. And like I don't always agree with everything, but there's like I don't know. There's something else. There's like a special connection. And yeah, sometimes I could be offended when, or not offended, I don't know, react to when someone doesn't actually know the band that they're wearing their shirt or whatever. But like, yeah, I think maybe like kind of getting over that and realizing, there's nothing to steal. Like this is metal really, isn't. It's just this, it's, yeah. Not having anything to point at this is what metal is kind of like the essence of metal. At least I kind of think so.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and it might might be a good way to go forward. But this was a lot of fun. I had a great time.
I want to say first, I'm super stoked that everyone came together and we did this. I've been looking forward to it, and thank everybody for coming here and doing this. And I'm looking forward to the near future when hopefully the masses realize that all the media and content they've been consuming is already being made by robots, and the whole industry collapses, and that people who make their living and feed their children by using imperfect tools to express themselves are freed up in a way to actually pursue that, and go out on the road and have the events, so we can not we so they can form connections and build bonds and see three-dimensional people as opposed to just sitting back and mindlessly consuming everything. I'm very much looking forward to that. And yeah. And again, thanks.
I first want to say again, thanks, Dave, for reaching out to me and inviting me on and helping me overcome my nervousness, despite the fact that I do a show. I always, for whatever reason, sometimes I don't always feel comfortable talking about something I spent more of my life doing than anything else.
Yeah.
Being a very, very poor person, traveling, and at one point living in a van. But I want to end on this note, and hopefully this is a note that aligns with Sean's statement about culture. I live in Mexico now because I can no longer afford the United States of America, especially can't afford my native San Francisco Bay Area. And a friend of mine who lives here as well, we took a bus, cost about 20 pesos, to Tijuana. And I live in the city of Rosarito, which is like a quiet beach town. Tijuana is a proper major metropolitan area for Mexico standards. And as we got off this bus, we heard music. And we had a disagreement where we were coming from. And I was like, I'm going to follow my ear because I think I know where it's coming from. And we walk around a corner in downtown TJ, and we see in an alleyway a punk show, metal punk show, whatever you want to call it. In a dirt alley, there's extension cords everywhere. There's a makeshift PA that I'm totally frightened is going to topple and fall on somebody. There's kids from ages of probably 5 to 50. Parents had brought their kids. There's a mosh pit going. They made a impromptu skate ramp in the alley out of concrete, which I thought was also interesting. A little half pipe. And so there's kids trying to figure out how to, bomb down and do tricks, trying to get to the top of the skate ramp. There's people moshing. There is a metal band playing that sounds like really bad Hellhammer. And I'm enjoying every bit of this moment because I'm the only a-hole with my camera out. Everybody's digging it, headbanging, talking. The older folks are kind of talking. There was a guy behind me who had a daughter that was about 11, and he was trying to get her to go into the mosh pit, and she was like terrified. She was terrified of this mosh pit. But, then him and I had a conversation because I have a daughter who's 24 now, who still thinks dad's not cool, but I've been taking her to shows since she could, since I was allowed to let her leave the house, like with her. The chick was going to shows. And even though she came to visit me recently, and we went to go see Godflesh because they were up in San Diego. And it reminded me of the purity of my own youth. Because we didn't walk around, we didn't have camera phones back in my day. Every moment didn't need to be immortalized for people to know that you were there. And There was a skate shop nearby, and there was like another band in the skate shop, and we were talking to them because they spoke a little English. My Spanish is horrible, and nobody said, check me out on Spotify, download my song. If they didn't burn a CD off whatever the hell they could record it on, you weren't going to hear this band. And now I'm not saying that we have to get back to this moment, but there is something about owning physical media. There's something about being there, and there's something about community that we have to get back to. If we're really serious about building a left, it happens in these meat spaces. We have to go back to that. As much as we may shit on DSA or PSL or insert organization here, we have to go back to these places, because this is where the real shit happens. In West Oakland, where I was living before I came here, there's a group called West Oakland Punks with Lunch. And for the 3 or 4 years that I saw them do it, every Sunday they would bring food to this massive homeless encampment, and food turned into supplies. It turned into supplies like, here's clean needles, here's condoms. We want to be a part of this community because some of us live in this community, right? And when I think of the music that we're talking about, I think of that. And I look forward to us all recreating that wherever it is that we live. So thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, Jason. All right, everybody. Take care.
And now a quick message from our sponsors. Just kidding. This will be neither quick nor from any corporate or state sponsorship.
What's up, everybody? Thank you so much for watching all the way through. The fact that you made it to the end means you get a gold star. Yeah. What I'm going to do with this little bit of time remaining at the end is give you the quick rundown on everything. I'm kind of assuming an audience of people who are not reading all the emails that I send out, who are not registered with Theory Underground, who are not taking ongoing courses at Theory Underground. And so you might be someone who's come to the channel for the first time, in which case you probably just think that this is a YouTube, in which case, well, of course, you're partially correct, but mostly wrong. Because if you look right here, what I have is a course site. It is its own platform on theory-underground.com. But it's not just courses. These courses are gateways to a bigger and more important conversation that is just getting started. And really, after this next month that I'm taking off to get married and to go on a honeymoon, once I get back, the conversation and the events really kick into gear. There's going to be a national tour that will have a sort of international component, not just because it's online, but also because we will be going into Canada, Mexico, as well as potentially Europe. So stay tuned. I mean, we've been invited to Hong Kong. There's talk about going to Thailand. But it's kind of dependent on the people who reach out to us and talk to us, because this is all word of mouth and DIY. I'm not doing marketing. I'm not really trying to pursue new clicks through the algorithm outside of basic cooperation kinds of projects that I do with people like Todd McGowan, Chris Catrone, Nina Power, Daniel Tutt, etc. The point of doing what I'm doing with all of them is to say, yes, this is a part of a bigger conversation. This is beside everything going on with the media left and TheoryTube and Theorygram and all of those other things that are happening in the theory scene. But what I hope to establish through Theory Underground is a more rigorous and hybrid, sustained kind of dialogue with the people who are really serious about the life of the mind. And so, that means not just watching videos here and there and then telling other people, oh, I've got about opinions and then these videos say something about me, but instead drilling down into fundamental concepts, questions, problems, tracing out the contours and inherent constitutive contradictions of the fields that we are in. And so what I hope to see come out of the theory scene is an intellectual milieu, but this can't just happen overnight. It happens over time. And these courses are just to be a part of that unfolding. Most of these have already happened. So, Mikey teaches Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do. While he's teaching that course, I was simultaneously demonstrating how to be an active, critical, engaged student, right? And I did this exact same thing with the What is Sex course, where really it was Cadell Last from Philosophy Portal who was heading up everything, but it was me who was kind of modeling that student. But I also have co-instructed some courses here, like the Professional Managerial Class Consciousness and Ideology course that I co-instructed with Elton L.K. of the Working Class Intelligentsia and the Dead Parrots Philosophical Society. Elton L.K., great guy, love him. But, he's just one of these people who are in my organic intellectual milieu sort of network. And then the people that have come in through the virtual have an opportunity to ground out into that organic network by meeting up with us on tour. A couple of other people in that organic network who are here from the very beginning, and I've done stuff with them with a lot of other previous projects, was Brian Weeks and Ann Snellgrove, who are co-instructors for the Idea of the University course right here, which was the first course launched at Theory Underground. But if you want to meet some of us, if you want to actually ground out in the organic network, if you want to actually break through the walls that kind of come with these media form and actually get the vibe, you'll want to meet us in real life, in person. And we are prioritizing the people who are reaching out to us and filling out the form for the Theory Underground US Tour 2023. And so if you go to the tab on the website, on the header called events, you go to the drop down for US Tour 2023, then you can fill out this form here, and then there's a high likelihood that we'll try to do one of our events in person wherever you are at. And so we're trying to add only real people who are serious about meeting in real life, because if you prefer to stay in the role of a consumer, of someone who just kind of subscribes to content and clicks on it whenever you're just kind of distracted from whatever you're doing, that's totally fine. But if you're actually looking to get to another level of discourse where it's not just we're talking at each other, but instead we are in a field and we actually have reference in that field that go beyond just idle chatter, then you'll want to get involved with this for sure. So that's the main thing. I wanted to tell you that once I come back from the honeymoon and the time away for the wedding, the events are really going to kick off. The tour is going to be what I'm focusing most of my energy on. But at the same time that the tour launches, so too will 2 books be published from Theory Underground. One is my book, Timenergy, and the other book is Underground Theory. There will be big names such as Slavoj Žižek, Norman Finkelstein, Todd McGowan, Alenka Zupancic, as well as Nina Power, Daniel Tutt, Chris Catrone, and a lot of nobodies like me. Just people who have either dropped out of the university system or never even enrolled, who are nonetheless passionate about studying theory as a way of life. That's what this book is. It's 31 contributors towards underground theory, as well as critical media theory, ideology critique, the left and its critique, and there's even some essays in there on historical interpretation and the history of philosophy. So these 2 books, the Underground Theory book as well as my Timenergy book, will be published and available September 1st. And that's basically when we kick off the tour. So if you want us to come to a city near you and talk about these books or do any kind of an event, then reach out, fill out the form. And as far as Timenergy goes, you can see right here, I've actually got the Timenergy course is now listed. This course is going to begin in September. So If you've been interested in the concept of time energy, if you're interested in a deep dive through the history of philosophy, drawing from philosophers as ancient as Aristotle through to more modern metaphysicians of time like Bergson or Kant, then this is definitely for you. But if you're even more interested in abstract time and domination through someone like Moïse Bastone, a sort of post-Marxist, or actually Marx, Bourdieu, Foucault, we could talk about disciplinary time, existential time. We're going to bring in Adorno. We're going to bring in Nietzsche, Arendt. This course is going to be going through the history of philosophy, mostly focusing on time, but also leisure and freedom as fundamental concepts, and developing time energy as a sort of imminent critique of many of these philosophers and many of these theorists, and of pretty much the entire political scene as it currently exists. And so this will not be a super intensive course. You're not going to be assigned entire books to read. There will just be a monthly lecture, sort of seminar lecture, as well as a monthly check-in kind of discussion group, right? And that discussion group is one that's going to happen very much like the critical media theory reflection cohort discussion group that's currently also ongoing. So if you are not already signed up with the critical media theory research cohort, then you'll definitely want to get signed up with this time energy research cohort, because it's going to be arguably as good or better than the critical media theory one. But both of these courses are not too intensive. Both are ongoing, and it's never too late to join the critical media theory one either, right? We've already gotten a bunch of signups 2 months after the fact, because this isn't something that will just end in 6 months. We're going to repeat it. And for the people who join late, they actually get to be in the next one as well. So get involved with the time energy course and the critical media theory course. Same thing goes with the being in time course. We're reading all the way through Martin Heidegger's Being in Time as one of the most profound, difficult, and important deconstructions and critiques of everything that we take to heart, that we presuppose just taking for granted as natural, as subjects of modernity. This is what we do. And Heidegger is one of the greatest enemies of modernity, as is obviously Friedrich Nietzsche. And so both of them are the kinds of frenemies of any serious thinker who's trying to interrogate their own most closely held presuppositions, right? And so if you've ever thought about taking on a challenge like reading Being in Time all the way through, then it's not too late. You can actually still enroll in this course, and you can do the reading on your own for Division 1 over this next month. And then once you're caught up and you've gone through the lectures for Division 1, Division 2 will actually begin once I get back in mid-August. Okay? So there's a tour, there's books, there's courses. What more could I possibly add? There's an app. And that's been something that has taken a lot of my energy and effort away from Theory Underground as a website. It's because I've been mostly problem solving the app for the last few months. But what I am currently showing up on the screen here are tickets. Every time there's an error with the website or my app, I have to open a support ticket with someone who's responsible down the line for figuring out how to problem solve the bugs. And so I've opened 1 million tickets. As you can see on the screen, these are tickets that I opened between basically mid-July and the beginning of May. But then I can go back, and I'm just showing you on the screen all of these different tickets, almost as a way of showing off that I've been doing constant troubleshooting in the background, because I'm on the fly learning how to operate and run not just like the sort of ins and outs of a course-based or course-gated social media site, but more importantly, that I'm building the actual platform, and that I'm doing it where I have to troubleshoot everything with programmers, a team of programmers. And it's all good preparation for what I hope will happen as Theory Underground gets a little bit more steam over the course of the next year. Eventually, I'll have a dedicated team of programmers, not people who are like these people, divided between 1 million different tickets that they are problem solving, but instead having my own dedicated team. Anyway, so the app, right now all I'm showing you is that there's a lot of support tickets opened, but we've actually reached a point now where I think that the app is about to go out. And if you're curious about that, just know that it's going to have like the capabilities for you to be able to message people who are on Theory Underground, for you to be able to partake in the forums and social groups, the social groups, including the multilingualism, language learning clubs, as well as the film club. But more importantly, it will be a way to subscribe on a monthly basis so that you have access to everything going on at Theory Underground. Not just all the courses, not just all the conversations, but also all of these B-side specials that we've been doing. These are not listed on the regular website. They're not listed on the YouTube channel. They're specifically reserved for people who are subscribers, who are really plugged into the kind of ongoing conversation. And so if you're curious about that ongoing conversation, just know that there are Theory Underground hub events. That's kind of what we're calling them for right now. But basically the hub events are like this one coming up here. Like right here, as you can see, there was a hub event on July 11th. There's another hub event coming up on July 18th. And as you can see, there's an office hours event that happens during the hub event. But more importantly, there's a panel of presentations on hardcore theory, a panel of presentations on hip hop, as well as a special segment on critical media theory reflections, where even if you're not in that course, you still get to kind of partake in one of the things that's going on with that course. And these kind of hub events where it's like one Zoom call for the whole event, it's going to be like 6 or 7 hours long with different segments on different things, are really just an opportunity for people who are fellow travelers to drop in, to say hello, to kind of get the vibe, to see what's going on. And most importantly, for people who are in ongoing courses or in past courses, who have questions about the text, have questions about the lectures, who have reading reflections that they've done on that week's reading, who want to talk about it, to be able to come to the office hours, because every hub event will always have an office hour segment where basically the students in currently ongoing or past courses have priority, meaning that if you take this professional managerial class consciousness and ideology course, or the idea of the university course, or this, for they know not what they do course, any of these past courses that you take, you've got weekly questions as you go through it. You'll always have someone to come talk to during the office hour events that are happening at the Theory Underground Hub on a weekly basis. So I just really want to stress that, because otherwise you might feel like, oh, I'm left behind. These courses are already in the past. They're already over. There's nothing I can do. I just have to binge it on my own and I'd be all on my own. No. Not only is there a live ongoing office hours kind of event where you can come and discuss what you're doing, but more importantly, there's also the forums. And so a lot of the video conversations we have related to these specific courses, those videos get uploaded into the forums on those specific topics, and then you're looped in. And the people who have taken those courses in the past, they're reminded about the content of those courses, and maybe they want to go back over some of the stuff, and it kind of keeps the discourse centered around the subject matter, instead of just all of us talking, acting like, oh, well, we know what we're talking about. We know without even having gone through the same readings together. We just know that we all kind of know. We get it. No, this is what Heidegger calls idle chatter. This kind of communication that tends to happen online is symptomatic of what happens when all of the connections that we form are in these virtual networks that don't ever ground out in real life discourse. There's something about real life discourse with voices and faces and the actual kinds of non-perceivable pre-conscious things that occur in person that a lot of us are very removed from. And part of what I'm doing with Theory Underground is attempting to bring together my organic network with the virtual network. And so if you belong to the virtual network and you want to ground out in my organic network and actually get to know me and people that I'm fellow travelers with like Anne Snellgrove or Brian Weeks or Elton L.K. of the Working Class Intelligentsia, people that I have co-instructed courses with, that I have as sort of connections in real life. You know what I mean? It's going to be these events that are on tour, that are your best way of actually grounding out from the virtual into what I'm calling real life relationships, right? And so hybridity between IRL and fully consumer, algorithmically enticed online, whatever the hell we're doing on here. Ultimately, what I've built here with the app and the website, as well as the publishing arm of all of it, is an opportunity for people to be in an ongoing lecture, research, and publishing cohort, and to be able to ground out in something more real than just the, whatever you get from the algorithm, and that provides the conditions of possibility to go from just being a part of the theory scene, where it's influencers on platforms talking to fans or whatever, to instead become a fellow traveler in an actual intellectual milieu, where whatever you put into it, you'll get back 100-fold. That's what I'm trying to lay the groundwork for here, is the sort of antidote to so many of my frustrations at the university, or trying to organize outside of university, or just trying to be some kind of a YouTuber or whatever. No, so much more important is what's coming from this tour, from this app, from these courses. And so if you're watching this, if you're thinking about getting involved, there's no time like the present, because really it's people's involvement in the first couple of years that makes all the difference. I understand that the longer these PSAs and the more unpolished or underproduced or less frequently published this YouTube channel actually is, the lower engagement is going to be. The algorithms will continuously neglect, right? But it is the people who watch all the way through and to the end who are already pretty serious, and they're looking to potentially get more involved, and that's who I care about. And the channel can ultimately wither away and die, because what's coming from my own platform and from my own medium is something that is capable of something so much more than anything anyone's ever imagined could come out of the internet. And the Timenergy book and the Timenergy course are coming very soon, and a lot of people have been excited about that and have been wanting more on that. And so if you are one of those people who's excited about it, register soon. Go to theory-underground.com, go to the Timenergy course, register for it. There's 4 tiers of involvement. Those who do will separate themselves from those who do not. And it's the doers ultimately that are going to make the difference. So I hope you're one of them, and I'll see you on the other side. Take care. Peace.